Hello and welcome to IndieLoupe. I've got a bit of an odd one today, a review-ish, if you will, of an entirely free game, the Red Pearls of Borneo from self-described hobbyist game developer Bushmonkey. I call it a review-ish because while I will cover it in just as much depth as any of our other reviews, there will also be some wider ruminations on stuff outside of the game itself, mainly the nature of free games, which is certainly of interest to me and hopefully to you too. I suppose I should start by admitting my own skepticism surrounding free games. I'll try to avoid digging too deep into the minefield that is pricing a game, but, rightly or wrongly, my brain tells me that if it doesn't cost anything, then it's not likely to be worth anything. We can probably thank capitalism for that, but I would say that my lived experience with free games does somewhat corroborate it. The only things I tend to make exceptions for are daily games like Jamwitch's The Daily Spell, which, no bias, had an excellent guest writer last week, or bite-sized experiences like Jamwitch's My Friend the Monster Trainers, or Jamwitch's The Case of the Dungeon Descent. And yes, haha, funny joke, I used the same developer 3 times there, but what it does portray is my total lack of reference points within the modern free game landscape. I did try to dive into some longer titles after playing the Red Pearls of Borneo, which itself took around 5.5 hours to complete, including additional content, but if I'm being entirely honest, couldn't find much else to persuade me against the notion that you are typically getting what you pay for. I don't say that to dunk on free games, I'm sure there are more out there that I'd enjoy if I found them, but because I suspect it's probably a pretty commonly held belief, and even if you feel that way too, I think the Red Pearls of Borneo is worthy of, well, not your money, it's not asking for that, but your time. I mean, we'll get into the fact that it would be worth your money too, but I suppose the headline, the takeaway, is that I'm not saying this game is fantastic, asterisk, for a free game, but that this game is just fantastic, no qualifiers. My favourite game of the year so far. So stick around and I will tell you why. In the Red Pearls of Borneo, you play as Delphine, who is a sensitive, effectively a psychic detective, who's been hired to investigate the events that took place on a remote plantation in Borneo on the 16th of December, 1941. All accounts indicate that everything was fine on the morning of that day, but by the 17th of December, everyone who had been there was missing, presumed dead. Nobody knows what happened to them, and given the geopolitical climate in 1941, nobody ever found out. The problem is that was 7 years ago, and Delphine is halfway around the world in London. But luckily, with her abilities, that's not as large a barrier as you might expect. Armed with nothing but an unlabelled map of the plantation and a collection of portrait photographs, you, as Delphine, will aim to map out a complete version of events for each person who was on the plantation at the time, around a dozen people, from the early afternoon of the 16th to the early afternoon of the 17th. The only way to get a complete vision of what occurred in a given location at a given time is by selecting that location and that time, and the exact people who were present. For example, the only information you have to go on initially is that Jeremiah Goodwill, the plantation owner, was alone in his study at 4 p.m. So at the start of the game, you'll focus on the study, focus on 4 p.m, select Jeremiah, and only Jeremiah, and hey presto, you'll get a nice little scene of old Jerry making a telephone call. That needs to be precise. If there were 4 people in a room and you selected 3 of them and attempted to focus, your vision would be unsuccessful. You would need that 4th person. While that can already be quite difficult, it's made even harder by the fact that you start the game knowing only 2 identities, Jeremiah and 1 other person. Before you can assign any of the other people to a room, you need to figure out who they are. For that part, unless I missed something obvious, there is more guesswork involved than in games like Return of the Obra Dinn or The Roottrees Are Dead. In your first vision, for example, you'll learn that someone is called Lucas Sterling, but even if you're going to indulge in a bit of racial profiling, whether it's this guy or this guy or this guy is not entirely apparent. You can often make educated guesses, and your educated guesses are, more often than not, going to be correct, but on a few occasions you might need to assign a name a couple of times before you correctly identify them. If you've played a lot of these sorts of games, you might have to untrain yourself from thinking that that's cheating, or brute forcing it in a way that you're not supposed to do. By intention, again, unless I'm missing something obvious, there are occasions when you'll know, for example, that two characters are alone together somewhere at a particular time, but have to try out a few locations before you can nail down the right one. It's very rare for that to be a case of just trying everywhere. There'll only be 3 or 4 places that are plausible, and eliminating the incorrect ones makes thematic sense here. Delphine is trying to focus on an event that didn't happen and so cannot get a vision. What's more, if nothing happened in a room at that time, the game will tell you that, again framed within the psychic aura that Delphine is picking up being so faint that she can establish that there was nothing going on at that time. There is one final way that you can get glimpses of what happened in a room without needing to know everyone that was present, but I'll leave you to discover that for yourself. I have to admit that all those aspects combined meant it did take me a little while to get the hang of everything. Early on, when I hadn't figured out who many of the characters were and was less familiar with the game's systems, there was an occasion or two where I struggled with knowing what to do next, but after I cleared those early hurdles, it was pretty smooth sailing. The game has some excellent ways of accessing various timelines for both rooms and people, so despite having a pretty large amount of information to keep track of, it never got too overwhelming. It's very easy to find where you've got gaps and to start looking around those gaps for clues as to how you can solve them. I mentioned back in my TR49 review earlier this year that with these narrative deduction games, I think striking the balance between those two aspects, narrative and deduction, is difficult. For my tastes, The Return of the Obra Dinn is the only one that has, historically, done it perfectly. For TR49, as much as I enjoyed it, I felt the deduction side of things came up a bit short. I never really felt challenged. For others, I really enjoy the way those deductions work, but then find myself indifferent to the story being told. One part invariably feels secondary to the other. It's either a narrative game with deduction mechanics included, or a deduction game being propped up with a story that mainly serves to facilitate those deductions. Which is fine, they're still my favourite genre at the moment, but the holy grail is one that manages to do both. And for me, the Red Pearls of Borneo does. When a deduction was straightforward, which is inevitable in places as there's something like 100 scenes within this game, I didn't mind because I was engrossed in the story, and there were certainly enough times that it wasn't so obvious which kept my brain ticking over. You might have occasions where you can chain a few events together relatively quickly, but then you'll need to go away and dig around to find the next block of the story. I found the ebb and flow of that incredibly satisfying. A few easy tasks, uncomplicated but still engaging, and then a nice tricky one, and then back to some easy ones, and so on. That loop kept me focused on the game, but never led to me getting too frustrated with it. If I'm looking for something to pick at, then perhaps that's the reason there was one part of the game that I didn't enjoy quite as much. After you've completed the main story, there are no less than 3 smaller side stories. They all use the mechanics of the main game, but 2 of them include basically no deductions. They're each just a long chain of events. They're both well written, but I was so securely in the I'm deducing things mindset, having spent the previous 4 hours there, that it felt a little jarring to then be in what was more or less a linear visual novel. I guess the best analogy I can draw is that it was like when you're really enjoying playing a game, and then suddenly you're thrust into a 20-minute cutscene. You can appreciate that it's good, but it's not necessarily what you want to be doing right at that moment. I'm still happier for having played them. I think they're worthwhile additions that benefit the story, but I do think they feel slightly at odds with the rest of the game. I said this was my favourite game of the year so far, and look, I suppose favourite is pretty subjective. You might argue that just by being in this genre, I was always going to enjoy it, but I don't think that's really the case. We can look at the two games that have thus far received the Evil Trout treatment as an example of that. For the uninitiated, developer Robin Ward, or Evil Trout, has started to garner a reputation for taking free itch.io games and working with the original developers to remaster them as fully fledged, paid-for releases on Steam. He did it for the Roottrees Are Dead, one of my favourite games from last year, and is currently in the process of adapting another incredibly well-received game, Type Help, into The Incident at Galley House for release later this year. The itch originals of both those games are, in my opinion, difficult to get into. Treating my contempt for the AI art of the original Roottrees very much as a separate matter, I still find it really unintuitive compared to its remake, to the point that I never found it enjoyable, despite being, as far as I'm aware, almost identical in terms of the puzzles and the story. Type Help, too, while likely the biggest individual influence on the Red Pearls of Borneo, just doesn't cooperate with my brain. I get it, I understand the concept, but I've tried to enjoy it 4 or 5 times now, and something just doesn't click with me. They are, regrettably, the archetypal free game for me, ones which I understand have quality but find too rough around the edges to enjoy personally. And look, while I'm sure you could give the Red Pearls of Borneo that Evil Trout treatment, in a not dissimilar way to how Type Help is being adapted with fully illustrated rooms and voice-acted transcripts, I don't know that it needs it. For me, it's already entirely accessible as it is. A couple of minor issues, sure, but nothing so severe that I would have felt put out had this been a game that I'd paid for. Bushmonkey is adamant that the Red Pearls of Borneo will remain free. In fact, as of yesterday morning, he announced that it will be coming to Steam at that same, non-existent price point. And as much as I think it's worthy of a few shillings, I hope that means that an awful lot more people will play it, because it is deserving of a much wider audience. I suppose that's the whole reason that I'm talking about it now, right? So, if you're still watching at this point, I trust that you will go out and try it. The whole free part makes it flat out the easiest recommendation of my semi-professional career. And once you do, you too can be one of those people who played it before it was cool. Hell, you can put a comment down below right now so that you can prove that you knew about it before everyone else. People still like to do that, right? I know Bushmonkey's currently working on another adventure featuring Delphine, one which I'm sure I'll want to play whether it's free or not. You'll probably hear about that in a video right here on this channel as soon as it's released, so subscribe for that, I guess. Thanks for watching, go play the Red Pearls of Borneo, and I will see you next week for something completely different.